Good morning. The topic this morning is sanctions, or are sanctions. And before you tune out and decide, oh God, sanctions, I'm not interested in it, let me argue for a moment that sanctions and sanctions as part of international politics is probably one of the hottest and most consequential topics in the world today. So, what are sanctions? Sanctions are meant to be punishments. Punishments to show one country to show another country of its displeasure. Sanctions can be very narrow, its displeasure about a particular narrow economic or technical or political policy. Or sanctions can be all-encompassing. You're just simply saying, we are not trading with you, we're not exchanging people with you, we're not allowing tourists to come to your country. In other words, we'll punish you in every imaginable way in which we're connected. Now, let me backtrack for a minute and say, so we had the Cold War, and then we had globalization. And globalization was thought to be a good thing. It interlinked countries, and the idea, amongst other things, was that everybody would benefit by having everything globalized, trade, fairly open, and so forth. And it harked back in the economic sense to an old idea, which was comparative advantage. If the people who have comparative advantage in climate and can therefore grow things more cheaply than somebody else whose climate is different, let that country grow those things and then you import them. If labor is cheaper in country X than in country Y, then why not let country X produce whatever the cheap clothing or whatever, and you import it, and everybody's economy in the world will be better off because you will allow comparative advantage to take its root. But the political side of it was also, if countries are so interconnected and so interdependent, then they're less likely to go to war, to have nasty political conflicts, because they know that the welfare of their own population is dependent on this openness and this exchange, right? That was the idea of globalization. And now we've reached a point where more or less everybody agrees that globalization has come to a halt. And it's come to a halt for a variety of reasons. Let me just highlight one of them, or two of them. One is the United States, a declining power, wishes to stop China, a rising power, from rising as quickly as it seems to be and as influential as the Chinese seem to be worldwide. Allow me to point out that China is the largest trading partner for 120 of, roughly speaking, 200 countries in the world, right? So from the perspective of the US, which is still the strongest economy, this is still not a good thing, because if you have trade relations with a country and human exchange relations and so forth, you have some influence in the countries, right? So China has been very busy getting influences in many countries in the world, both in terms of trade, natural resources, exchange of people, and so on. So that's China's rise is one aspect that has reduced the globalization idea. The other is the Ukraine war, the Russian war, the energy crisis, and all that goes with it, which I won't rehearse right now, and you're well aware of. And so the idea is that there are now, multiple competing countries in the world which are not in particularly friendly relationships with each other. And for that reason, as well as climate change and other things we've talked about, the era of globalization is over. most analysts believe, and we're in a new era. And the question, of course, is what does the new era look like? Because generally speaking, one only recognizes the components of a new era once that era is obvious to everybody, or it's been going on for many years, and its political and economic and social components have become clear. None of this exists now in the post-globalization era. What does exist right now is that roadblocks are being put up here, there, and yonder, especially by the United States, in terms of reducing the interdependence, the economic interdependence from the era of globalization. Now, let me backtrack again and say that sanctions, which are a way of punishing a country by barring its exports, by barring its population, by barring technological exchanges, by barring financial exchanges, and so forth, are not new. As we speak, there are about 20 countries upon which the United States has sanctions. They range from, Cuba to Syria to Venezuela to Iran to Mali to the Southern Sudan to Zimbabwe. I mean, I could go on. And some of these have been in existence for a long time. For example, we have had sanctions on Cuba for the last 20 years or so. Well, more than that, since 1958. A long time, right? And Castro came into power. And the idea of sanctions, of course, is that it is leverage to get a country to do what you want it to do or stop doing what you want them to stop doing. And let me suggest to you that a history of sanctions indicates almost total failure. Sanctions don't work. Sanctions don't work for a variety of reasons. If the United States puts on sanctions on country X, it may be real hardship, but the hardship typically does not change the regime or change its policies. In fact, most countries dig in. And furthermore, other countries can come to the rescue of a country and substitute for the country that has placed sanctions on trade or some other items. Again, Cuba is noteworthy, right? We've had sanctions for all of these years, and Cuba's regime has not changed. What the sanctions have produced is a very poor country, a country which has reason to, be upset about the United States and its relationship. In a sense, it's in every imaginable way, our sanctions on Cuba have failed. It has not changed its regime. It's still a socialist, Marxist, whatever regime. And let me give you a different example. Iran, right? We've had sanctions on Iran now for years. What has it produced regime change? No. If regime change is about to come or may come, it's an open question in Iran in the near future. It has very little to do with US sanctions. This has something to do with, the death of that woman and telling women they have to take off their headgear and all kinds of internal things. But it's hardly the case that the sanctions have worked. And even right now, if you look at US sanctions in Russia, which is the most recent huge barrage of American sanctions, to get it to change its policy in the Ukraine, I think a reasonable person would say these sanctions haven't worked. Yes, it has created hardship for the government. It has created hardship for some individuals. In the case of Russia, we not only sanctioned the government and trade and exchanges, but we also sanctioned the banks, right? And we sanctioned individuals, the elite who are very wealthy and who own things all over the globe, houses, yachts, and so forth. But basically, the Russian policy has not changed. It's created hardship. And as often happens with sanctions, others have tried to step in to assist the country. what kind of governments have tried to substitute, at least partially, against U.S. policy and sanctions? Well, China, well, Iran, well, Turkey, all kinds of countries. Most recently, Saudi Arabia made helpful decisions with respect to petroleum by not cutting production or increasing production. So all kinds of actors step in to not necessarily resolve the issues or the shortcomings which have emerged because of the sanctions, but at least to help those countries out. I will say sort of dogmatically that the history of sanctions indicate that sanctions on the whole have failed. Now, there's one illustration that somebody could raise and saying, didn't sanctions work in the case of South Africa and overthrow the apartheid system eventually? And the answer is yes, but the sanctions against South Africa were worldwide sanctions. So that, in a sense, it wasn't the United States sanctions against South Africa or one other or two other countries. Eventually, the apartheid regime was sanctioned by not every country in the world, but large numbers of countries. And South Africa was boxed in, that is to say, it couldn't operate anymore, really. Because the sanctions were global. Very rarely has that been the case. This is the one outstanding case of sanctions having worked. But on the whole, sanctions have been failure. Now, what is the U.S. doing in all of this? For some reason, the U.S. has always believed that sanctions work even when they don't work, or that they may work somewhere down the road. For example, in the case of Cuba, exactly when the U.S. imagines the sanctions against Cuba are going to work is by no means clear. But the idea continues to resonate in the government. The Biden administration has not substantially changed American policy towards Cuba from the Trump administration and the Bush administration and on and on. So both Republicans, Democrats, and many, financial advisors in the government have somehow think sanctions are a good thing, or at least sanctions are less costly, they think, than, for example, if you have a shooting war or a conflict of some other reasons. But of course, countries that put sanctions on enemies or other countries often also pay a price for it, right? So we are in the business of currently enhancing sanctions on the technology side of things with respect to China, right? China should not benefit from the areas of technology, computer chips, all kinds of technologies that we are advanced in and from which China has profited. So the idea, I suppose, is to slow down China's economy. Or if you want to be more generous, it's not to slow down the Chinese economy, but for the Chinese to mend their ways. Well, it is very unlikely that the Chinese are going to mend their ways based on U.S. sanctions. What is likely is that the hostilities between the United States and China will increase, and this is not particularly a good thing, either for the United States or the world. So then you say, well, all right, the Chinese are, stealing American know-how. Yes, they probably are stealing American know-how in all kinds of areas. And it may very well be that at the high end of U.S. technology, the U.S. wants to develop its technologies without sharing it. But on the other hand, of course, very often technologies have been developed, science and technologies, by joint endeavors of one kind or another in cooperation. And then you're saying, well, we're not going to have this cooperation anymore. In many areas of technology, the U.S. is very much ahead of China, but there's some areas where China is actually ahead of the United States. But even if this was not the case, right, why alienate a government if, in fact, alienating it will not produce the results you want. They won't change the government policy. There's no evidence that sanctions in general change government policies. Look at Iran, look at Cuba. And will it, slow down economies or technologies? Maybe it will, but maybe there are alternate resources. So, for example, when the U.S. applies sanctions on with China or somewhere else in an area of technology, and the Europeans decide that the U.S. sanctions are not well thought through, or they don't want to go along with it, there is then the circuitous route of getting the information, getting the know-how through European channels rather than American channels. There are ideas that float around having to do with sanctions saying, well, we can have sort of long-term import. For example, let us slow down the exchange of Chinese students and Chinese technologists and academics because those exchanges help China develop the technical competency that they would otherwise lack. That would be a good thing to do, right? And at the same time, let's not give visas to people who want to do graduate work in science and technology and engineering in the United States. And let's not invite academics to come to the United States. Let's not give them visas. That sounds like, a serious thing to be doing. That sounds like, gee, that's going to hurt the Chinese. Well, in a way, it hurts the Chinese, but in a way, it hurts us more, actually, because having people educated in the United States is actually helpful in connecting China and the works that China does in science and technology with the United States, which is actually in the long term a good thing. And also it leads to further alienation, and it leads to the influence of others on China. So, for example, since it's very difficult nowadays for people to get visas from China to the United States, China still wants to send people overseas to A, get the skills, and B, learn English. So they just go to other English-speaking countries, right? And if you are Chinese wanting to study, let's say, English, and you can't go to the United States, you might go to New Zealand or Australia. Well, we say, well, we're sitting in Santa Cruz. What's the harm in that? Those are nice countries. Let them help educate those people. That's partially right. That's partially a good thing. But on the other hand, the linkages between human beings will then be between Australia and China and not the United States and China, right? So it's very short-sighted. Sanctions are applied in the United States in massive forms at the moment. And then you might say, well, who applies these sanctions? Well, of course, the president and the government sets these policies. In the case of China, Secretary of State Blinken and head of the National Security Council Sullivan, they are very happy to support the idea of putting every imaginable technological sanction on China. But who implements them? Well, the various departments of government, depending on what the issue is. The Commerce Department, the Agricultural Department, the State Department, you name the department, they are all in the business of generating topics for sanctions and then implementing them based on the overall policy of let's stop the Chinese from doing X and let's stop the Chinese from doing Y. Ditto, and I could go through a similar song and dance with respect to Iran. We've had sanctions on Iran now for years. Has it changed the regime? It has not changed the regime. Has it had a negative impact on Iran? Yes, it's probably had various kinds of negative economic impacts. But bear in mind that when countries suffer or have economic reverses based on sanctions that are applied to them, not only do alternate countries step in, right, who can supply some of what the country needs, but eventually the population gets angry about the country that has made their lives worse. So the Iranians may be very angry against their government for a variety of reasons right now. But many of the Iranians, including many of the elite Iranians, are also don't feel warm and fuzzy towards the United States. So if the government were to fall, would we immediately have an ally? Probably not, right? So it's short-term thinking, long-term thinking, even intermediate range thinking about sanctions is seems to me a very bad idea if you follow the U.S. rule book, which is in the absence of wanting to have, real war, the better thing to do is to use economic leverage. And we are the most powerful economy in the world, so we can, exercise leverage. As I pointed out earlier, the Europeans are not really going along with this idea on the part of the United States. They think it's short-sighted, and I must hasten, as you already have gathered, I agree with them. It is short-sighted. You want as much economic interlinkage, even in the post-globalized world, as is possible. And the other thing we have learned through the Ukrainian situation is that, of course, the technologies from different countries in different parts of the world differ, right? So once a country has invested in a technology and with one country, it's difficult to switch, which, of course, for example, this is not a sanction issue so much. The Ukrainians were using Russian arms and technology, and the American warfare technology is very different, and the U.S. has been very busy to try to train them up in the use of American technology. In the meantime, for the last year or so, East European countries, which also had the warfare technology from Russia, have been sending that and having had it replaced by Western and American technologies. So when you get out of the business of interlinking, as was true in globalization, not only sharing information, but interdependence and linkages between various technologies. When you lose those linkages, somebody else may step in. And when you decide you will get rid of the sanctions, your linkages, your natural structural linkages from those countries have been radically reduced. So if you want to be a major world actor, which the United States has been and continues to want to be, the business of using economic warfare and using economic warfare, especially in the area of science and technology, to deprive countries of their prior linkages with the United States, it seems to me, is very short-sighted. It doesn't work in the short term, it doesn't work in the medium term, and it certainly won't work in the long term. So then you say, well, all right, so the globalization is over. We're all going to hunker down and become nationalistic and confine ourselves to developing national competence. And let me just spend a minute on that. It is the case that we are now aware of the fact that our interdependence means we all of a sudden don't have access to X or Y because it's produced somewhere else. Right? And so their Biden administration has a point when it says, okay, we need to have national competence. We need to be able to produce shoes ourselves and cars ourselves and all the rest of it. The idea that in some areas you will need to have stockpiles in case there's warfare, in case there's climate issues and so forth, is probably pretty much correct. You don't want to be entirely dependent on another country for the vaccines of a disease. You want to have some stockpiles that are adequate at home. So, from that perspective, a certain amount of inward looking and autonomy in your economy, and making sure that in essential industries you at least have some stockpiles, that part makes sense, it seems to me. But what doesn't make sense is the idea that you will all of a sudden decide, well, you've been, let's say, 90% dependent on certain chips being produced in another country, and now you will, go 90% of not having anything to do with that country and its chips. You're going to become totally autonomous in a world that is sufficiently interdependent because of the movement of people, the movement of a climate changing circumstances, the fact that technology, as in communications, links the world and so forth, does not mean that you can go back to the 19th century and have hard shells around countries and not have a fair amount of interdependence. So somewhere there's an intermediate place between globalization, where you don't really care where anything is produced, and deciding that you're going to become very nationalistic and autonomous and so forth. And in any event, most of the countries of the world are small, they're interdependent for economic reasons. Climate change is making countries somewhat more interdependent in some parts of the world. There are very many small countries. There's no way that they can produce their own technologies and will be dependent on others. Will they be dependent on the US or China, depending on what the politics of it is? So that there is a kind of a sane middle ground. And I'm afraid that we've swung the pendulum too far. And I realize this is a subjective point of view on my part, between, on the one hand, having gone gung-ho interdependence in the globalized world, and now all of a sudden going into some kind of retreat as the US and saying, okay, now let's sanction more and more things in the world. Let's hunker down. Let's close our borders. Let's become more and more autonomous. As I said, a little in this direction will go a long way. And finally, I want to say that if one is talking primarily about the US and China, and I think I'll talk about China the next time, it is very foolhardy for a declining power like the United States to have the attitude we currently have to China, namely that they are our enemy and that we need to cut various kinds of linkages. Yes, China is to be criticized. They're meeting right now. They're a dictatorship. We don't need to go into all of that. But the hostility right now towards China is what the British would call over the top. That is to say, rather than hurting China, we're going to hurt ourselves in the long run unless we develop sensible policies and don't decide to apply sanctions and embargo on everything imaginable, that we're going to be interdependent. And finally, let me just say that even if in the area of science and technology, one wants to be conservative in terms of what one shares and what one doesn't share, in terms of natural resources, there is no way that we can get out of the business of some level of interdependence in the world. For example, 90% of the inputs for our batteries of the earth component of it comes from China, right? It is much of the nickel, much of the copper that we need for our modern economy is lodged in other countries. So we can't, on the one hand, we can tell China to buzz off. On the other hand, if we need 90% of the rare earth that we need for our batteries, we better continue to have the channels open so that we can benefit from the exchanges. So on the one hand, it's easy to say, let's apply sanctions here, there, and yonder, but let us not overdo it and convince our public, we the taxpayer, of the idea that we can separate ourselves from China, from Iran, from oil-producing countries, from other countries that produce natural resources, and also from countries that we need to share into managing climate change, because that, by all odds, requires interdependence and sharing a cooperation. So the rhetoric of sanctions and the rhetoric of we're going to hunker down and close our borders to all kinds of exchanges needs to be dealt with very carefully, very cautiously. And as I said, historically, the record is that sanctions fail. But I hope I convince you of the fact that sanction and sanction politics is not some kind of sideshow, but is absolutely central to world affairs in this part of the century. Thank you. See you again in 2 weeks.